Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. I love having podcasters on with me because one, we get to talk shop, but two, we get to take the conversation in a lot of different directions. And this guy is a podcast host. He is an administrator of a group on Facebook called Christian Podcast Guest. He does a lot of things around podcasting, but he's a great guy, has an incredible story to tell. And it's my honor to welcome in Eric Nevins to the Intentional Encourager podcast. Eric, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Brian. It's exciting to be here.
I'm excited to have you because I wanted to start here with our conversation, Eric. A lot of people have taken the last 18 months or so since we've been in the midst. Now we're pushing almost 20 months as we record this. Everybody has had a different perspective around it. I live in West Virginia. We've had a different way that we've dealt with things here. We have a smaller population. And so maybe we haven't had some of the challenges that other people have faced. Take me through the last 18 to 20 months or so and the biggest lesson that you've taken away from the time that we've spent in the pandemic, and maybe something that you have done differently that after this is over with, you're going to continue to do from it.
Oh, wow. Okay. Lots of good questions there. For us, the interesting thing for my family with the last, let's say 18 months or 2 years, is, we've all kind of been in this trauma, right? Like the world shutting down and dealing with COVID, I think is trauma for the whole world. And we're all kind of going to see the effects of that. My family actually also, so about a year before the pandemic, experienced a trauma when there was a shooting at our kids' school. And so interestingly for us, like we felt like we were kind of just starting to come out of that experience and feel like, okay, we're getting back to normal a little bit. And then the pandemic hit. And so then we kind of went back into that sort of mode of like, okay, we're just trying to survive at this point. Let's just do what we got to do and have kids at home and shift a little bit. So we've been in a lot. It's been really kind of an interesting season for us. My wife's she was in school for a couple of years there. And so that was kind of a dynamic, right? Change in the family, which was great. I'm glad she did it, but it also meant got to pick up some more kinds of things. So I kind of have two perspectives. I have like that perspective where like, yeah, that's the thing. Business wise, not much really changed for me. I was really happy to welcome the rest of the world to the Zoom culture, right? Like of meeting people. I've been meeting ever since I
join me here in this medium, will you?
It's great. I do this all the time. As a podcaster, I literally talk to people all over the world, on Zoom. And I think that's fantastic. And I'm glad that it's kind of more culturally aware. Now we all kind of know how to do Zoom, even if we still do the thing like, hey, can you hear me? All that stuff.
Your internet's fading out, especially here in West Virginia, because it's, internet is kind of a luxury for us. I mean, it's, it's not something that we have great success with here, even though everybody needs it. We don't, right? It's like but Eric, let me jump in here for a second. You mentioned the shooting at your kid's school. That in and of itself, I want to kind of divert here for just a minute. Take me through the encouragement that you had to provide your kids around that. Because there's a couple of things as a parent of a college student. There's a couple of things that my mind is going to right now. And I'd love for you to share your thoughts around it. The first thing is getting them past maybe the survivor's guilt or the fear of it happening again. And the second part of how I'm thinking around this is the encouragement that, hey, this was a one-time event in your life. Yes, it was traumatic. You'll never forget it. But encouraging them that life goes on and that we have to get back up and dust ourselves off and go about our day. How did you and your wife lead your kids through something like that. I mean, that to me is just a horrifically unfathomable thing to have to lead your kids through.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And just to imagine what could happen. Now, we were fortunate. All of our kids were totally okay. They weren't terribly close to the action. And didn't, I don't think, even heard things. They did have traumatic things like SWAT teams coming into their rooms and checking the room with their guns, right? That was sort of scary. It was really heartbreaking when I think he was he in second grade? Maybe he was in third grade. And he showed us the spot where he was hiding under the desk, right? Under a table. Like, that's just, as a parent, you can't really put into words how just disturbing that is in your spirit. But to go to what you were asking about, how shepherding the kids, my wife is an advocate, and that's really one of her core traits. And so she took the lead on that. She was like, okay, we got to get them all the things that they need. Fortunately, Colorado, I'm guessing, I don't know this for sure, so if somebody fact checks this, that's okay. But I think in response to the Columbine tragedy 20 some years ago now, they had set up a fund for counseling for victims of shootings like that.
Yeah.
And for some reason, Colorado's had, I think, more than its fair share of shootings. Someday I'm going to have to study that. But so we were able to take advantage of that and get the kids counseling, talk to them. I think, mostly that was probably our biggest thing. And then just kind of help them navigate the trauma of trying to be like, okay, your school year's over 3 weeks early, right? You're not going back. You don't get the closure. And so that's kind of happened a couple times now so we had that 1 year, and then we had COVID the next year, and it's been kind of disruptive. And I'll tell you what, that their generation is going to be probably the most resilient generation that we've seen in a long time, because they've had to deal with a lot, even as children.
I love what you said there, and I'm just jotting that down, the most resilient generation, because I believe you're right about that. Because, and Eric, I've said this on other podcasts, and for those of you listening, forgive me if I continue to go back to this, but you've led into it so beautifully, so I want to touch on it. I believe that for us, our generation, I'm 49. For me, the defining moment of my generation in my lifetime is 9/11, September 11th, 2001. And I have said for my 21-year-old, the defining moment of his generation is going to be March the 12th or 13th, 2020, when the world shut down.
Right.
When literally overnight, colleges shut down for Marshall University, where my son goes to school, they immediately shut down for 2 weeks. They immediately just halted all in-person and virtual classes because they needed to figure it out. They just immediately shut down. Grocery stores shut down, churches shut down, everything shut down. So that's the defining, I believe that's going to be the defining moment for their generation. But you're right. And that's why I asked you the question that I did, because I see so many ways that business has evolved. You talked about Zoom a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Zoom becoming so incredibly popular that everybody, I have a Zoom call, and it's like Google, right? It's, let's Google this or something. Now Zoom is just, when you say the word Zoom, people automatically think it's a meeting or a call between people in different parts of the country. They're different parts of the world. When you think about, let's go here for a second. Let's talk about our faith for just a minute, because I believe it's you've touched on something that's really important. What do you feel is going to be the legacy of the resiliency of our faith through these times? Because we look in the scripture and we see, I'm reading in Romans right now, and I'm reading about the Apostle Paul and all the things that he went through. And there's a thread through the New Testament where the Apostle Paul is very resilient. Even though he goes through a lot of things, you see the Apostle Paul's resiliency come to the surface. He continues on in spite of the things that he's gone through. when you look at the people you talk to, maybe where you're at, where do you see the resiliency of faith coming out of COVID? Now, I hope I asked that question correctly.
Oh, that's a great question. And it's another one I've been thinking about a lot, right? Because I believe in new media. Like you said, we have this great opportunity to share our messages around the world. That's why I lead Christian Podcasters Association, because I know that the more Christians that I can help take that step to find their voice and share the gospel in their niche, whatever that is, like could be all kinds of different. We have people who do widely divergent kinds of podcasts, but they're sharing the gospel in their way with their people, right? I think that's how it goes out throughout the world. Having said that, I believe all that. I was honestly a little disappointed with the sort of COVID response from most churches, particularly the ones that were saying, hey, basically we're going to put our service online, and then that's going to be our response. Because I think social media, for instance, is designed to be social, right? There's a whole new way that people learn and interact. So when you ask about the legacy, what I think COVID demonstrated to a lot of people is that the structures that we've had were really good for maybe the last 500 years, but perhaps it's time to entertain the option to adjust and shift some of those. I can give you an example if you want. Like there's a great article conveniently timed in like November of 2019 by, he wouldn't have known, but by Sky Jitani, who hosts the Holy Post podcast. He's one of the guys on there. And he wrote a article at Premiere called "The Case Against Sermon-Centric Sundays." And in that, what he proposed, he's a preacher, and so he admits like it's kind of hard for him to do that. But he goes, look, people can get better sermons through podcasting and other tools than they can get at church. So maybe we don't need to do so much of that, but we need to give people as an experience. This, by the way, is the same problem movie theaters are going to have to address, right? Give them an experience they can't get anyplace else. So same thing with
I got to jump in here. I love what you said there, because the thing about it is, and I love how you address movie theaters, because movie theaters had to adapt and change. It had to be some place that was a step up from what you could get at home.
Right.
Hey, why are you going to sit at your house and watch this when we got these nice reclining seats? We've got the atmosphere. You need to come here and take it in, because we've got the surround sound and things like that. And Eric, I think you hit on a really good point, and I want to go here for just a minute before we take a break. A lot of the reason that church is fantastic is the experience of being together. The Bible says, "Forsake not the assembling of yourselves together." There's energy when people come together, as they did in Acts chapter 2 in the upper room. The Bible says they were in one mind and one accord. They were in one place, one mind, one accord. And there's an energy there when people come together in like-mindedness of spirit. But I'll be honest with you. When I watch services online, I had to kind of make myself get into the moment, because I was literally walking from my bedroom to my living room. And I would try, I was like, okay, do I dress up for church? Well, let me at least put on a pair of jeans and a button-down shirt, instead of what I'm wearing now, which is joggers and if you're watching on YouTube, a Cincinnati Bengals Nike shirt. But or people would go, well, let me just roll out of bed and go to church, and they're in their pajamas. Like, I would never do that if I was going to church. I still wear a suit and tie to church. So I mean, it's But I feel like we miss. I love what you said there, and that's why I wanted to just dive a little bit deeper there. You hit on something really good, is that I think a lot of churches are saying, well, hey, this is great. We can do this differently, and maybe we don't have to pour as many resources into the in-person experience, and we can throw more resources there. And I think there's a danger there of putting all your eggs in that basket. Go there for a minute, if you will, because you just hit on something really, really important.
Yeah. Well, so I think particularly in America, and I'm really cognizant that this is an American evangelical problem. So in a lot of ways, what we've made our church services, this is not true for every church, but a majority, a good number, we've made them sort of this show on Sunday morning, right? The band gets up and they sing, and then the guy, it's depending on your tradition, usually a guy, gets up and talks about scripture for a half hour, 45 minutes, right? And that's fine. We need that. The problem is that you also hear the same people start to discuss the fact that they don't think that Christians are being discipled well. But that's the main part of the way that they're trying to make other disciples, is by preaching at them every Sunday for 45 minutes, right? It's not working. And so what we need to do is think about our services or at the times that we're gathering a little bit differently. The church has historically done this every 500 or so years, certainly with the invention of new technologies, aka the printing press and the internet, right? Those things kind of adjust and evolve, and I think we're in the middle of that right now. I'd love to see personally services that or times to gather more focused on communion, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it, and also maybe more of a conversation. I'm kind of a conversation guy, so I would love to see the next time I get up in front of a congregation, which I don't do often, but I have. I would love to form that as a conversation and say, look, okay, we're going to have a conversation, us and the Bible, you and me, all of us in the Lord. We're going to talk about this and let's see what this is like. And I think it'll be quite a different experience, but it's also takes into account our mission to help people be more better disciples of Jesus and the ways people learn. I think we need to do that.
I'm there with you, and I want to step aside and take a break, but I want to just stay here for just another second or two. I'm a part of our worship team on Sunday mornings. I'm a part of the praise band. I play keyboard. To me, I want to bring my best to those 300 or 400 people that I'm playing for. Obviously, I want to bring my best to the Lord. But those people are coming together to worship the Lord. And that may be the only chance that they get to be with like-minded brothers and sisters during that week. And so I feel a responsibility that the first note I hit on the keyboard, I got to be on. Like I've got to be on, because those people in some ways are depending on me to help lead them into the presence of the Lord, and for Jesus to come and be in our midst. And Eric, I've always felt that responsibility, and I love what you said about the way we structure church now. It's like, well, let's get it started with some kicking tunes, and then let's transition to a message, and it's almost become a playbook, so to speak.
Yeah, and look, that is historically rooted, right? Like this is the Wesley model, right? Wesley kind of ran around and did that, right? That he kind of pioneered that. That's okay. It's all right. I just think we need to do that. And look, let me tell you this. I'm just going to really clearly say I appreciate pastors. The reality is church staffs everywhere. We're also going through trauma, trying to figure out what to do and scrambling. I get it. And so I have a lot of compassion for that. And I understand why maybe there wasn't a huge amount of imagination in some of those contexts, but I think we have an opportunity. And I think that's what COVID's kind of brought out. And I also think we need to start taking into account how people learn. I'm not a pastor, so I didn't have those responsibilities, right? So I just wanted to say that and just acknowledge it. Yeah, I get it. It was hard, but hey, there's an opportunity out here.
I love where this conversation's going. Let's step aside and take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about Eric's podcast, the Halfway There podcast, and get some thoughts around podcasting. Look, if you are a podcaster yourself, or you're thinking about maybe doing a podcast, Eric may have some ideas for you and some encouragement for you. But this is a fantastic conversation with my guest, Eric Nevins, joining me on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Back in just a moment.
Hey everybody, Brian Sexton here. I want to tell you about our sponsor, SEO National. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Now what's that, you might say? Well, search engine optimization helps you show up higher on search engines in front of paying customers for words that you as a business owner can monetize. What a great concept. SEO National is owned by my good buddy Damon Burton, who's been a guest here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Not only has Damon and his team worked with businesses of all sizes, from e-commerce startups to NBA teams and Shark Tank featured businesses, but more importantly, Damon and his team are about transparency, trust, and providing lifetime value. So much so that he still has his first customers after opening SEO National 14 years ago. Let me give you some intentional encouragement and call Damon and his team today at 855-736-6285 or go to www.seonational.com and get a free quote.
Eric, let's get into your podcast, the Halfway There podcast. I know why I started this podcast, the Intentional Encourager podcast. Take me through where the idea came from for your podcast. And if you would, what have you taken away from podcasting that you didn't think was an unintended benefit of doing your podcast?
Yeah. So I started my show. So my background is in spiritual formation. So I wanted to be a pastor for a long time. I got a Master of Divinity to be a pastor, and then I graduated kind of in the beginning of the Great Recession, and that was not a good time to be looking for jobs, right? So I ended up staying in the financial world. A lot of things happened, but that eventually I ended up clicking a bunch of electronic buttons and listening to podcasts all day, and that's how I fell in love with the medium. But I wanted to contribute to that spiritual formation conversation. Here it was, better part of a decade after I was in school, and I just still wanted to do something that would serve Christians. And so what I did is it was a long process. It took me 2 years, but I ended up starting a show called Halfway There. It's that name is kind of one part hat tip to Bon Jovi, because I figure if you can leave singing, Living on a Prayer, then you probably won't forget the name of the show. And one part just saying, hey, we're always on the journey, no matter where we are. So I have people come on. I ask them to go through their story. I walk them through it. We talk about the highs and the lows and everything in between. I often talk about the dark night of the soul. I'll ask that question almost every episode. Have you experienced the dark night of the soul or gone through the spiritual desert? Because I believe the spiritual journey is longer, wider, and deeper than we've been told. Most churches can only take you so far, and then you have to kind of figure it out from there. And I wanted to encourage people to go, hey, this is normal. God's people have been struggling with it for millennia, right? So it's okay. And here's a story about how somebody overcame that.
Well, and here's the thing. Life has those same components. Right. It's not just exclusive to Christians. Everybody in life, and this is what I tell people, Eric. I say this. I said, look, if you haven't gone through something, just wait. Life at some point will take you through. And man, the first time I really experienced something, I was 30 when I lost the guy that was my best man at my wedding. That hit me. And then a couple of years later, my father-in-law passed away. But man, the last 10 years, losing my dad and losing jobs. And I mean, I really understand how, to your point, you can feel like life is, it's literally the sunshine before the hurricane.
Right.
You have, you're going out for dinner or something like that, and you come home and your house is on fire. And so I love what you said about that. What have you learned from the responses that you've gotten from folks around that question? Because, man, I've had people tell me things on this podcast and they go, I've never shared this before. Or they've said to me, let me tell you about the time I overcame cancer. I had a recent podcast where a guy said, I got swine flu and found out I had a rare disease that causes sudden death. and I had to get a pacemaker put in. So yeah, you find, what have you found out from that question that were those V8 moments? Like, man, I didn't realize that.
You know, what I've learned is that God is always working, and he's using things that I might otherwise be tempted to be a little bit scornful of, right? So like, I can't tell you how many people I've heard whose lives have been changed by somebody in like a campus ministry, or 3 or 4 people. I mean, so maybe 260 episodes or so, and I've had at least 3 people whose families or personally came to Christ because of Billy Graham, right? Like, really? Like in 250 episodes, like that's not that many. So it seems like an awful lot, especially considering the bulk of his ministry is what, 40 years ago, right? That's pretty interesting. I think there are other, there's lots of other things also that God is working even when you don't know. One of my favorite stories to relay is a guy named Dan Rudman, who I was fortunate enough to interview my first year. He was in college, and his RA decided to show a Josh McDowell film and about relationships. He was like, "Oh, I'm kind of interested in those." And as a result of that, he ended up giving his life to Christ a couple weeks later, never saw the RA again. And so the RA has no idea that his faithful action of sharing the Josh McDowell film, 12 students showed up, whatever, actually brought somebody to Christ who turned out to be an evangelist, and he's preached the gospel around the world to literally millions of people, right? Because that's what he does.
Wow.
So I learned from that, like, oh, okay, just be faithful with the thing that you are called to do, and leave the results to God, because you don't know what's going to actually happen.
Have you had a moment on your podcast where it was a blowback moment, where somebody just told you something, shared something with you that made you kind of sit back in your chair and just go, "Oh my goodness, what just happened there?" Take me through a moment like that you can recall pretty easily.
Man, trying to remember just one, right? In 260 episodes, there's a lot of them.
I know, right? I mean, it's, we're pushing 200 here. So, I mean, yeah, I get it.
I think just about every episode, there's something that somebody tells me that I'm like, wow, that really blows me away. I'll tell you one. I recently interviewed a woman named Christina Dent. She'd be a great guest for your show, by the way. And she had an organization called End It for Good. And she's working to kind of overturn our drug policy, or reshape our U.S. drug policy, which is kind of weird for a Christian, right? Like most of us are like, hey, if you do drugs, you do the time, right?
Well, that hits close to home because, we're 15 minutes away from where I live. There's a lot of people that would consider Huntington, West Virginia, the epicenter of the drug epidemic. And so, that hits really close to home there. So, yeah.
Well, she said something really interesting. She said that we got to change our assumptions about why people do drugs. Like the assumption often, especially in Christian circles, is, well, they do drugs because they're bad people, they're sinful, right? Which we're not going to argue about sin, but that's not why people do drugs. Usually people do drugs because they're trying to escape some sort of trauma. They're trying to deal with trauma. And so then what we do is we catch them and then we lock them up, which sending people to prison is actually a traumatic event. So we're trying to heal trauma with trauma. And that just sent me like, wow, okay, that is a good point. And yes, she convinced me that we absolutely need to change this in some way. Great. So the story of how she got there is really fascinating, how she changed her mind, and I love her work. But that kind of stuff happens all the time, that just blows me away.
What's your biggest piece of encouragement for podcasters today? I'm going to ask you this question later, but it's a good time to ask, what encouragement do you have for podcasters?
Yeah, for podcasters, I would tell them, look, it's a slow growth medium for most of them. We're not going to have Joe Rogan numbers, right? Millions and millions of listens, but the average podcast has 124 downloads within 30 days of release, right? So that doesn't seem like very many, but if you imagine 124 people in your living room, that's an awful lot of people, right? If you had a book signing and you showed up at a Barnes and Noble or someplace, and 124 people showed up, you'd be pretty pleased with that, right? So it's a pretty good crowd. You learn to, do the things you got to do to develop that, but then you can grow beyond that if you're patient, and it's worth doing. Your message, you're going to grow in ways that you would not have expected, just by finding your voice. So that would be my encouragement.
Eric, I've made some really good friends that started out as guests on podcasts, and that relationship just grew and grew. And people ask me, they say, why do you podcast? And I say, because of the connections you can make and the people that can come into your life that become great friends.
Well, I'll tell you what, that's been the thing that really probably surprised me the most about podcasting. I didn't really expect it. When I started, I was working at a bank. I call that bank jail. I was going to a cube, 6x6 cube every day, willingly. But it's that I didn't care about networking when I worked there, right? Because it didn't seem to do much good for me. But when I started my podcast, man, I've had a chance to meet so many people. Just before this call, I was sending off interview requests to a couple of authors. I have some books that I'm like, I need to read that, and they'll show up. I'm sure the publicist will get me connected, and I'll get to talk to those people. I've gotten to talk to people like Oz Guinness. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's one of his books is one of the reasons that sent me on this kind of journey where I decided to tell stories instead of, trying to tell people what to think, or you should believe this because of the Bible. I was like, no, what if we just tell stories instead? I find them more powerful. I actually got to share that with him, and I don't know how impressed he was with it, but he did say, yes, stories are how we shape a culture. And that, so that was pretty cool to do that.
The funny thing is, we'll step aside and take a break, was when I started my podcast and I reached out to friends of mine and I would say, hey, would you come on my podcast? And they were like, yeah. And then they began to say, hey, you need to reach out to this person and have them on just like you did a few minutes ago.
Right.
You need to reach out and get with this person. And the connections have been, I've always loved Zig Ziglar. Mm-hmm. And the coolest thing for me has been getting to know his son, Tom. And Tom's been on this podcast a couple of times, and we've struck up a great friendship. And that's been the cool thing is getting to meet people and talk to people and then just continuing that conversation offline or shooting them a text or something like that. That's been really cool. Let's step aside and take a break because I want to be sure and save time. You hit on it just a minute ago, being in bank jail. So I want to hear a little bit more about that, but I want you to get into your story and tell folks your story and some obstacles that you've overcome. My guest, Eric Nevins, the host of the Halfway There podcast and a podcast coach, speaker, joining me today on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Back in just a moment. Hey everybody, Brian Sexton. Want to tell you about my new book, People Buy From People, 10 Powerful People Lessons from the Ultimate People Person. My dad was one of the greatest connectors that I ever knew. And he shared with me 10 connecting principles that I have used throughout my 25-year sales and sales management, customer engagement, and leadership career that I'm passing along to you. If you want to be a stronger, deeper, and more powerful connector, you've got to pick up a copy of People Buy From People. There are concepts in there that you may not realize help make you a power connector. You can go to Amazon and pick it up, Kindle if you're an e-reader and you like to do it that way, or now available on Audible. And there's one other way you can get a copy of People Buy From People. You can get one from me and I'll sign it for you. You go to intentionalmediaandpublishing@gmail.com and send me an email, and I'll share with you the link on how you can get a signed copy. You can buy a signed copy directly from me. Again, People Buy From People. If you want to connect like never before, pick up your copy today of People Buy From People. And now let's get back to more great conversation here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Eric, let's get into your story. And I want you to go as far back as you want to go from point A to point B in the last few minutes that we have remaining. I mean, you've been so gracious with your time. Just take me through your story.
Yeah. So I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, and that with a Christian family, we were that family that was at church all the time, always involved in some way. And that was it. I really, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an actor. So I've always kind of wanted to be on the mic in some way. Ended up going, met and married my high school sweetheart. And then we went to Chicago. I went to Trinity International University, got a degree in biblical studies because I decided I wanted to be a pastor. And that journey was an interesting little experience of shaping me, because I discovered kind of in that time, I started studying discipleship. I started studying spiritual formation. And I've always had this kind of question about, like, well, how do we actually grow? I would see our people at church, we kind of would just do the same thing year after year after year, right? And we would I never saw any real, like, how are we changing? I couldn't see it. And so I wanted to study that, which is what eventually led me to seminary to do a degree. So I like to say that I went to college to learn to study the Bible, and seminary to learn how to pray. And those are the two things evangelicals will tell you to do, right? Read your Bible and pray.
Yeah.
Nobody will teach you how to do that. You got to get a degree.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But that's what I did. That's kind of the foundation. So I kind of alluded to the story earlier, but I graduated during the downturn, and that was a really tough time when, trying to figure out how I'm going to pay off my school loans, wanting to be in ministry, not quite sure how to do that. And then working at a bank for, I was there a total of 13 years. So it was probably 8 years after I graduated, bouncing people's checks. Let me tell you, that leaves a little scar on your soul when you bounce people, when your job is to ruin people's day all day, every day. I did things like visa fraud, looking for transactions that are fraud and things like that, which is interesting. It was definitely fascinating, but my heart was not there. So when I discovered podcasting, that was really something that I thought I could do. And I'll never forget a night when I was working overtime trying to make money to pay off my school loans. It was like 8:00, and I talked to this customer. And as we were wrapping up, he said, "You've got a really good voice for radio. You should be in radio." I was like, "Oh, thanks. I have no idea how to do that. I don't, but thank you. Maybe someday." And it wasn't just a couple years later that I was like, "Oh, I discovered podcasting." It's like, that's a thing that maybe I could do, and I could get into it. I already had some equipment, like a mic and things, from when I was into music, and so I was able to do that. And kind of the rest is history.
Let me ask you something. When you think back to that conversation, did you come away from that? Because I had people before I started my podcast, they said, "You should start a podcast." And I'm like, "So what do I do it on? Sports, sales? What do I do it on?" And you kind of vacillate. I don't know if you did this, Eric, but I did. I vacillated a lot. And I was like, "Yeah, I'll start it," or I'll get some research. And, I was like, "Yeah, it'd be a good idea." But you were talking so vividly about that moment. Did it feel like for you that was your moment of clarity, like that moment of, that's it? Because some people, they kind of get to that point at some point, but most people have that defining moment. And it sounded to me like when you were telling that story, that was your defining moment.
It was one of them for sure. I think I had a series of them. So that moment, there were a few others where I realized, because I would literally sit in my desk and listen to hours and hours of podcasts or audiobooks. And so I was trying to figure out, what kind of style of show would I have? What would I do? What would I like? And so at the time, John Lee Dumas, Entrepreneurs on Fire, he's, kind of big in the podcasting world.
Yeah.
I've gotten to meet him, by the way. He's great. But he at the time had a very, very rigid structure, right? He would ask the same questions of everybody. I was like, and so a lot of people were emulating that. It's like, I don't really like that. And then he had a guest who was a friend of his, Michael O'Neill, who has a different show called the Solopreneur Hour. And his show was much more conversational, right? And that's when I was like, oh, that I like that. I can get behind that. So it was these little moments of discovering I can do that. I could do it that way.
I've always said that. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like there is somebody sitting in an invisible chair next to me. And I said this on a podcast. I feel like there's an invisible chair sitting next to me, and somebody's sitting in it, and they're watching us have this conversation, and I'm feeling a little invisible tap on my shoulder going, ask him that. Ask him that. I really would want to know a little bit more about that. And that's what I've said to people. I've said, look, listeners want to be involved in a conversation. They don't want to witness an interrogation.
Right.
Because that gets tedious. That gets, I have to think. I have to, and I just, the best conversations, Eric, like this one, we've gone into a lot of different things,
Right.
and it's just been very free flowing. And you've said things that I'm like, I got to find out a little bit more about that. I've got to ask you about that. I want to ask you this as we pivot real quick. Take me through the biggest obstacle that you faced in your life, and the biggest lesson you overcame and learned from it.
Man. Well, in some ways, I think I am my own biggest obstacle, so it took me 2 years to start my podcast because I wasn't sure that I could do it. I thought that it had to be perfect in order for it to be valuable. And I was listening to a whole bunch of podcasters who either have teams or had been doing it for a long time. Right. And so my standard was incredibly high. And so I wasn't sure that I could do it. I'll never forget when I launched, I'd chosen a date, and I was an elder at my church at the time. We're having a meeting and we're asking for prayer requests. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to ask for this. And I asked him for prayer for the launch of the show. And I was almost crying because I was so scared. I was like scared to share it with this group of guys that I know they care about me and I care about them. Like it was, not even a intimidating atmosphere, but I was terrified. Yeah. And so I think often that kind of, maybe it's imposter syndrome, maybe it's something else, is probably my biggest obstacle 90% of the time. If I can just get over that. I'm struggling with it right now. I'm trying to do an event and it's ticking me off how long it's taken me to do, right? Because I want it to be a certain way and I can't get it, that way. And I've wasted a bunch of time. There's all these things. But the reality is if I just do it, it's gonna be a great event, even if it's scaled back from what I would like it to be.
Yeah.
I'm still going to serve a whole bunch of people and they're going to be encouraged. And that actually is my mission. That's the thing that I'm supposed to do. So trying to keep that in view is really helpful.
Well, Eric, here's the thing too. If I go back and I watch early episodes, I've got a terrible camera.
Right.
My microphone's not where I want it to be. I had to figure out this stuff. Like there are things that are still not perfect. They're good, and I listen to the show that I produce and I'm like, yeah, that turned out really good. But I look back at earlier episodes and I'm like, man, I've come so far, and knowing if I'd known then what I know now, I wouldn't have wasted money and time, and
right.
You just learn things. And Eric, I see what you're saying.
Well, I don't think.
Go ahead. Yeah,
I don't think your audience wants you to be perfect either, and that's something I had to learn. So for what it's worth, I get in trouble when I mention him. But for a long time, growing up, my mom, well, she still was, but my mom was a big fan of Rush Limbaugh. Right. So take the politics and just set those aside. I'm not as conservative as once I was either, but the thing Rush would do is he would, first of all, his music was amazing, right? So it would come in and you knew it was him.
Yep.
And that's a genius radio trick. Like if you just learn that thing, that's really good. Second thing is sometimes he would come in, start talking, and he'd still be talking to the booth, or I don't know if he was making somebody up, or who knows, right? But it wasn't perfect. It wasn't the perfect, like, here we are, ready to go, right? It was, oh yeah, well, what about that? Okay. And then he would turn his attention, and he did that for a reason. And he did it consistently. He didn't do it because even the conversation mattered so much, is my guess. My guess is he was letting you in. he was letting the listener feel
You know something about
like he was
Rush?
pulling the curtain back.
Well, and forgive me for interrupting, but you know something about Rush too? I noticed in later years that Rush became more deflective. He started having more guests. Granted, they were from the political world, but he started having more guests. And when people would call in, he became more deflective to the guest. It wasn't about you got through to me. It was, I saw an appreciation out of Rush Limbaugh the last 3 or 4 years of his life that was like, you know what? I have been very blessed and fortunate that you people have stuck by me all these years, that you have stayed through the ups, because Rush Limbaugh, you know, he went through, you talked about, he went through drug addiction. He went through the deal with ESPN where he made the despairing, he got fired from ESPN. Rush, he went through failed marriages. He went through a lot of things that he was in the personal spotlight, and people wanted to take him out, and he just continued to survive. And I think what I sensed about it, Eric, was he became more grateful and reflective.
Yeah.
And that's great encouragement. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's great encouragement for podcasters to remind yourself that yes, you have a show and you're the host, but remember that when people choose to download your episode, they're making a choice, and stay grateful to your audience and stay focused. Go ahead. You got something there that
100%. I agree. I suspect that in Rush's case, he, as his health was failing, that he was a bit more contemplative, and and that's kind of true for all of us. But yeah, it is good to keep your audience in mind, right? It's always a grateful thing. I often start my show by saying, I'm glad you downloaded. Thank you for downloading, right? Like you're listening to this episode. There are 2 million podcasts. You know, maybe a quarter of that is active, but you could listen to a lot of things, right? And you chose to listen to this show, and I appreciate that. I'm going to do my best to make sure you get an encouraging conversation that tells you some great stories, that makes you wonder at what God can do, and we'll take it from there. So that's what I try to do.
Eric, I asked you your biggest piece of intentional encouragement for podcasters, but do you have a piece of intentional encouragement to share with somebody that may be a salesperson, business owner, somebody who's just driving around? What piece of intentional encouragement comes to your mind?
You know, it's a little bit of a cliche, but I'm finding that it's really true. And I would say you need to be true to yourself. And no matter who you are, what job you're in, what you're called upon to do, you've got to know deep in your soul that what you're doing is the right thing to do, because that's going to come out, you know. And it's okay if you, so like in my case, I knew that starting a podcast was the right thing to do. I faced so many things that would kind of knock me off the pedestal, but I knew I had to do it. And if I didn't do it, I wouldn't have been true to where I wanted, to who I wanted to be. If you don't have that, I don't think you have much in the world, right? All kinds of things can change. Relationships can change, jobs can change, all kinds of other things, but you have to know who you are. I think obviously God plays a big part in that. There's lots of other things, but find your heart and do that. Sorry, that's a little cliche, but I think
it's spot on. It's spot on, because a lot of people don't know where their truth lies. A lot of people don't know what truth looks like to them, and it takes them a long time to get there. So yeah,
I really think a lot of people don't know themselves, and
it's a good point.
What I'm getting at, like you have a self. It's okay to have a self, and to know that. And I think one of the things that's good about the internet is more people are having the opportunity to discover themselves. This is why I tell podcasters, like, get started and do it, because as you talk on the microphone, as you talk to guests, you're going to discover an awful lot about who you are and what you care about. And that's a good thing.
Well, and it's repetition. It's doing it and doing it. And, you know, every podcast is different. Every episode is like, we spent the first 20 minutes or so today talking about faith and talking about the different nuances and layers. And And I loved it. And that, to me, is the crux of a great conversation. Tell folks where they can find your podcast, how they can connect with you, because you're going to want to probably download Eric's podcast and subscribe to the podcast.
I would love that. So the best place to go, first of all, you're in the podcast app, so you can just flip over and search for Halfway There. You'll find it. Otherwise, if you want to connect with me, the best place to go is halfwaytherepodcast.com. That's my show notes archives. You'll see the latest 9 episodes. You can scroll back and find other things as well. Lots and lots of good stuff there. And I have a free download too it's called What to Do When You're Mad at God. So if you have ever struggled with that, you can find it, and that's free. So,
man, that's awesome. That is so good. Eric Nevins, it has been so good having you today on the Intentional Courage podcast. I appreciate what you shared with us, and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
My thanks as always to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And of course, the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through his word. If you're not subscribed to the Intentional Encourager podcast, hit the subscribe button wherever you get podcasts so you don't miss an exciting episode where you can get encouraged and stay encouraged. And remember, anyone, anywhere, at any time, any place can be an intentional encourager.